Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our special presentation from the College of Law's Leadership Project, How to Lead, a discussion with David Rubenstein. I'm the Dean of the College of Law, and I've been lucky enough to hold that role for 7 years. And as many of you know, the Leadership Project is a new initiative at the law school. And so let me tell you a little bit about why we launched it. Law schools do a pretty good job still at teaching people how to think like a lawyer. And increasingly, I think we as a legal academy are doing a better job of giving people the skills that they need to actually succeed in the practice of law. But because lawyers tend to be articulate and kind of ambitious and prominent, they end up finding themselves in a lot of leadership roles beyond the mere practice that they engage in as lawyers. But the truth of it is that the traditional law school curriculum isn't really built to teach people how to lead. And people don't just become leaders, or they're not born leaders. There are a lot of skills that you can and need to develop if you want to be an effective leader. And so the Leadership Project here at the law school is really dedicated to helping our students identify and master those skills to be among the next generation of leaders, because we're facing difficult times ahead, as all of you probably intuit. And we need all of you in the law school and similar institutions to know how to lead us out of some of these problems. The Leadership Project is off to a fast start. I think we've had about 15 different events for students and alumni and friends. I've been lucky enough to participate in some of those. And students in the law school can take a prescribed course of offerings and presentations to complete a leadership project certificate type program. And our first cohort of the Leadership Project will be completing that this spring with many more to follow. This afternoon, I'm really excited to introduce our featured guest, David Rubenstein. I could spend literally the entire hour talking about his accomplishments, but let me just hit on a few. Like many of us, he is trained as an attorney. He graduated from the University of Chicago Law School, one of the nation's truly premier law schools, practiced in a number of large law firms, and also worked in the White House during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Later, he moved into the business world. He's the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest, most recognized, and most successful private investment firms. He serves as the chairman of the board of numerous entities, including the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Gallery of Art, a beautiful space I hadn't been to until a few years ago. They hosted an event for everyone who clerked at the U.S. Supreme Court on the 100th anniversary of the first person to clerk at the Supreme Court. I was lucky enough to go to that event, an amazing place to go if you've never been, and the Economic Club of Washington. And perhaps most notably for our discussion today, he is a thought leader in the areas of history and leadership. And among his many accomplishments, he's written 3 best-selling books, including the subject of our discussion today, How to Lead: Wisdom from the World's Greatest CEOs, Founders, and Game Changers. So David, allow me please to offer you a most hearty and most grateful welcome to the College of Law, albeit virtually. And I'd also like to introduce our moderator for today, who is really the brain behind the Leadership Project and the director of the project, Greg Marecki, who is, on top of many things, the head of our career services operation in the College of Law. And so, Greg and David, let me turn it over to you to take it away.
All right. Thank you very much.
Nick. And David, it's a pleasure to be with you today and appreciate your time. We are going to be talking about how to lead. This is one of David's many great books. I do hope you'll read it. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the vignettes in the book. But before we get to the book, David, we just watched the State of the Union yesterday. We heard all about, President Zelensky and the Ukraine. I'd be very curious. He's in the spotlight a lot. What is your thoughts on his leadership style and maybe a couple of things that you see in him that you think are particularly noteworthy?
Well, I've met with President Zelensky several times, once in Washington and I believe twice in Ukraine. And I would say he obviously was underestimated. He was seen as a professional comedian, got elected, and people probably didn't take him that seriously. I don't think President Trump took him that seriously. Now he is exhibiting leadership qualities that I think are making him a world-class leader. He's not leaving his country, not leaving his city. He's rallying his colleagues and his fellow countrymen. And I think when history is written, he will be seen as the perfect example of what to do when your country is overtaken by a foreign force. So we don't know what the outcome of that is going to be yet, but clearly, whatever the outcome is, for the period of time between the time that the invasion started today, he's exhibited world-class leadership skills. And obviously he's rallying the Europeans, and he's also, I think, getting the Americans to be very supportive as well.
Good. I want to go back to your experience in the White House before we get into how to lead, some of the vignettes on how to lead. You worked for President Carter, and you probably have seen him up close, when he was president. Could you share a couple of President Carter's best leadership qualities, and then maybe one or two things that you think he could have done better in terms of being a leader?
Well, President Carter was a novelty at the time. At that time, it wasn't thought that somebody from the South could be president of the United States because people from the South were thought to be not really in the mainstream because of racial issues, and they probably couldn't be elected. Carter was elected as a new Democrat. He was only 52 years old when he was elected. And as a result, I think he was not as experienced as he wished he had been. He had been governor of Georgia just for 4 years. So he was relatively new to the national scene. The result of that was that he had a fresh perspective. He was willing to try things that people told him you can't do. And people who hang around Washington for a long time basically come up with the conventional wisdom, you can't do this, you can't do that. He ignored all that because he was fresh and new and was trying to change how Washington worked. But he ran up against some roadblocks that he couldn't overcome. One of the things I think he could have done better is prioritize. He wanted to do everything, and it's hard to get everything done. So he didn't prioritize as much as maybe he should have. He didn't like politics. President Obama really didn't like politics either, and President Carter certainly didn't like it. And so if you were trying to convince President Carter of something and tell him this is the politically right thing to do, he would almost invariably do the opposite. And so when you don't like politics that much, it's tough to get members of Congress to do exactly what you want. So in hindsight, I wish probably spent more time on prioritizing, more time and being willing to deal with the politics of situations. But his great skills were that he was very smart. He was willing to do the hard work of learning issues, and he was willing to, I would say, try innovative kind of approaches to new policy challenges that came along. I'll give you an example of one of those. People told him that the conventional wisdom was you couldn't get the Panama Canal treaties through Congress as a Senate. The Senate would block it as a treaty. But he persisted and he got it done, even though there wasn't a lot of political support for it in the United States. So he did a lot of things that were courageous. Politically, some of these things didn't help him very much, though.
One of the other things, David, that I saw in Carter, was his humility. He came across as really a humble guy, and that's one of the things that you mentioned in your book as essential for good leadership. Was that just an observation that maybe is not right, or was that up close? Was he very much a humble guy?
Carter was a seriously religious person. Some politicians like to say they're religious, but they don't really go to church. They don't really pray that much. They're not born again as Carter was. And I think if you're a deeply religious person, I think that gives you a certain sense of humility because you realize that you're just one person and there's God that's really overlooking a situation. You feel certain humility. Some leaders are not as humble, let's say. Carter, I think, had a certain humility. He wasn't a person who had a self-deprecating sense of humor the way John Kennedy did. Some people that have a enormous amount of self-confidence, as Carter did, are really able to make fun of themselves. I don't think Carter really did that much, but he was a person who I think was humble, and I think that came to some extent from his religious background and from his modest roots. He grew up without any real money to speak of. He wasn't poverty-stricken, but he wasn't certainly a wealthy person.
Okay. Now let's move to the How to Lead book. You've interviewed a lot of leaders over the years, and when I read the book, I kept asking myself, I wonder which ones he found particularly inspiring. So now I get to ask you, who are a couple of the profiles that you featured in the book that you found particularly inspiring?
Well, it's like asking me which of my children I like the most, so it's very difficult to say. I would say that I had about 80 interviews that I conducted that I could have used in the book, and we put in about 35 or so. So we had to, weed some of them out. And if people I did interviews for didn't get in the book, I tell them my publisher wanted them out. I wanted them in. But of the people that were in the book, I was very close to many of those people over the years. I became very close to George Herbert Walker Bush after he left the presidency. He was affiliated with my investment firm. And I really came to admire his humility, his sense of humor, his leadership skills, which were quite unrecognized at the time he was president. But he did a terrific job on the Kuwait War, for example. And the ending of the Soviet Union, I think he did a terrific job in managing those processes. Of the people who are in the business world, I really admired Jeff Bezos for building that company from nothing, and Bill Gates for also building a company from nothing. They had incredible leadership skills to not only come up with the idea, but to lead a team. It's one thing to have a brilliant idea. It's another thing to actually build a company and remain as a CEO of that company. So I admire Bill Gates, admire Jeff Bezos a great deal. In the other area, I would tell you, as you may know, I'm a graduate of Duke University. This weekend, Coach K will have his last game at Cameron Indoor Stadium. I'll be there. And Coach K is in the book. And he's an incredible person who's as a leader. He is a native of Chicago. And after he went to the military academy, ultimately coached there, and then Indiana, then came to Duke, and persisted through some difficult first years. And now I think is probably about the most successful college basketball coach ever, and a real person in terms of leadership. He knows how to inspire young men to become leaders themselves.
Let me go back to George Bush 41. What specific leadership skills do you think he had that would lead you to call him out? I mean, Are there a couple of particular things in mind that you think he did really well?
Sure. George Bush's mother was a person who always told him, don't brag about yourself. So he was famous for not using the word I. I is the most commonly used word in the English language because people like to talk about themselves. But he almost never used the word I. He would start the sentence with a verb. And that was because his mother drilled into him the idea of don't brag. So when he became president, he wouldn't try to brag about what he did. He wouldn't take the credit that he was probably due for the Kuwait War or the ending of the Soviet Union and things like that. So I do admire his willingness to not only be humble, but most importantly, share the credit. In my book, I say that the best leaders are people that know how to share credit. And George Herbert Walker Bush was a person who actually shared credit. And he wasn't hogging all the limelight, unlike some leaders that we know. So I admire that quality. That was a really terrific one that he had, which was sharing the credit with others and making certain that people recognize that he wasn't the only person doing things that were successful.
Okay, great. One of the characteristics that you called out in How to Lead, you mentioned that a leader is typically someone who desires to build or create something, to go where others have not yet tried to go. And so I would say the concept of being innovative. Do you have a couple of particular examples in mind of that particular trait in action?
Well, sure. Look, by definition, anybody that's a leader is doing something that wasn't being done before. Lots of people can follow a leader, but there are very few people who can be leaders and actually get something done. And I think many of the people that I catalog or interviewed in the book are people that got things done because they actually had a vision of where they wanted to go. I'll give you an example. Phil Knight. Phil Knight came up with the idea of athletic shoes that were a little different than anything anybody else had done. He persisted with the idea, even though people made fun of him, including his own family, saying that wasn't going to work. And then he built the largest athletic apparel company in the world, and obviously been very successful at Nike for all the things that he's done there. Another person is Jim Baker in a different category. Jim Baker was in our firm for a long time. He was a person that I was given the assignment of, among other things, trying to round up global support for the war in Kuwait, which wasn't all that popular at the beginning before it was so successful. And he went around the world and begged for the money and got the money to pay for that war. And so we didn't have to really pay for it very much. And he built an incredible global coalition at that time. And that wasn't thought to be that easy when he was starting to do it.
So, do you think that the desire to innovate is essential? I mean, because there are a lot of politicians, at least out there, and in the coaching realm too. People that sort of keep the trains running on time. Some people would call them technocrats or sort of functionaries. Do you think the desire to innovate is essential, or is it sort of a nice to have in your view?
Well, the word innovation is a word that connotes technology or doing something that is kind of a technical change in something before. But actually, you can be an innovative person and innovate by doing things, as I mentioned, that Jim Baker did. Other people had never gone around and begged for the money that required to kind of fund an international war like that. I do think that if you're going to be a leader, you have to actually have a vision of what you want to accomplish. You can't just sit there and say, well, I'll go along with the other people, what they want. You have to say, this is what I want to accomplish. I know what I want to accomplish. And you have to convince other people of that. And in that regard, one of the most important skills is communicating. It's one thing to say, I'm going to build a great technology company, but if you can't convince people to work for you or follow your vision, it doesn't mean anything. In the end, when you think about it, and I say this in the book, all of life is really about convincing somebody to do something you want. So your spouse, your child, your partner, your business colleague, convince them to work this way, do something you want, follow you down this road or that road. Well, how do you get people to follow you? You can do it in one of three ways, in my view. One, you can be a great orator like Martin Luther King and get people to say, wow, what a wonderful speech. I'm going to follow him. Or you can be a great writer, Thomas Jefferson, writing the Declaration of Independence, and people will follow you. But the most important way is to lead by example. So if you want to get people to follow you, say, I'm going to do this. We should do this. I'm going to do it. You should follow me. And that's a very effective way to be a leader, the most effective way.
Can you identify a couple of examples of that latter concept? I mean, there are quite a few, of course. The one that comes to my mind is, and obviously you couldn't interview me, is Lincoln, right? I mean, he went and ministered to rebel soldiers in the Civil War. I mean, that was walking the walk. Are there particular examples that you have in mind from the book of folks who really walk the walk? For lack of a better term?
I talk about it in the book. Obviously, I didn't interview him, but George Washington. George Washington at Valley Forge did not have to stay there with his troops freezing to death, practically. He could have stayed in the Ritz-Carlton or the Four Seasons down the road somewhere, but he decided, I'm going to sit there with my tent, suffer the way my soldiers are suffering as well. Now, clearly, he wasn't suffering quite as much as the soldiers. He had clothing. Many of them did not really have full clothing. But by staying with his soldiers at Valley Forge, he inspired them because he was showing that he was going to put up with some of the sacrifices that he was asking them to put up with. And so that's the kind of thing I think is very often helpful if you're going to be a leader. Do the things you tell your people want them to do. A good example is the person we just talked about, the president of Ukraine. He could say, look, it's going to be better for me to communicate with you from London. So I'm now in London and I'm telling you all what to do to protect our country. But he didn't do that. He's staying there with them, and therefore he's leading by example.
Yeah, we've seen that on TV quite a bit. One of the other traits that you've identified in your book is the concept of persistence, as being a great leadership trait. Are there a couple of examples that you would point to that might be most illustrative of that concept?
Sure. Persistence is required because by definition, the world everything is solid, is where it is right now. If you're going to change something, you have to actually convince somebody to do something they're not otherwise doing, or you have to pursue something that isn't otherwise being pursued. And therefore, you're going to find people resisting you. People are going to tell you that's a stupid idea. When Jeff Bezos told people he was going to sell books over the internet, they laughed at him. And so he persisted. You have to persist. If you don't persist, you won't get anywhere. So it's very easy to walk through life just taking things as they come to you. But if you have an idea and you persist with it and you walk through walls, not in an arrogant way, but you persist with it, you're likely to be more successful.
One of the things that you talk about in the book is the importance of integrity as a leadership trait. Are there some specific leaders that you have in mind? It'd be great to talk about a few examples.
Well, what I cite in the book is when I started practicing law at Paul Weiss, and I graduated from the law school at the University of Chicago in 1973. I went to Paul Weiss, the head of the firm, Judge Rifkin, who at the time seemed to me an old man ready, was half in his grave, I thought. I was 23 years old. I looked it up recently. He was actually a year younger than I am now. So he actually wasn't so old as I now look at it. But he came in and he said to the young associates, you only have one thing in life that you carry throughout your life with you, and that's your reputation. And it takes a lifetime to build it and 5 minutes to end it. So don't take the path of least resistance. Don't make ethical mistakes. And that always stuck with me. And I do think it's very important to be honest and to have a great deal of integrity. Now, there are many people who can be rising up who are not honest. There's maybe some presidents of the United States who people would say are not honest and are not models of integrity, but they shouldn't be your role models. Your role models should be the people that are full of integrity. When your people tell you you're honest and you have integrity, you should feel good about that. You shouldn't feel good when somebody says, hey, you're pretty clever. You really cut a lot of corners there. You really got ahead that way. Is that going to make you feel better? I don't think so. It shouldn't, at least. So I think having integrity is really an important part of being a great leader, in my view.
Do you think, and this is a little bit off script, do you think that the current political system kind of it creates a disincentive to have integrity? I mean, it seems like we have a different situation now in 2022 than we did even back in the 1970s or 1980s. Do you think that it's harder to exhibit integrity and survive?
I think it is very hard. And this is the reason is this. It is said that the love of money is the root of all evil. Well, that's probably true in the case of politics, because the way our political system works now, if you have a lot of money in the bank, you can scare off opponents. If you have a lot of money in the bank, you can give it to other people who are running for campaigns and you can get favors from them. And if you have a lot of money, you probably are more likely to be elected, not just scare off people from competing against you, but probably more likely to be elected. And most importantly, as members of Congress know, when you have a lot of money and you don't spend it, you get to keep it. You can keep it, not for personal use, but you can keep it essentially for any political purpose the rest of your life. So members of Congress are always chasing money. And since it's against the law or the Constitution to bar people from spending their own money because it's a matter of free speech, the court has said, in the end, members of Congress spend about 40% of their time, certainly in the House, raising money. And when you do that, you don't usually get money from people that say, I want something right down the middle. Give me a nice, moderate, bipartisan position. I'll give you money. What people say is, if you do something on the far left or far right, that's what you're going to get support for. So members of Congress are torn because while they recognize what they're doing is selling their souls in some respect, that's the process we now have. And so I think it's a terrible system, and it's not one that's designed to lead to a lot of integrity. Clearly, members of Congress are saying things that they don't believe are true. They're saying things they know are ridiculous to say, but they don't want to upset their base. They don't want to upset their fundraising base. And so you have ridiculous things being said most recently in the most recent presidential election, for example. Members of Congress knew, certainly members of Congress knew that the election wasn't really stolen, but in the end, because President Trump said it was stolen and people were afraid to upset him, people who were his supporters began to say it was stolen, and we led to the kind of messes we had on January 6th and other things.
Okay. Let me go to another thing that you identified in the book. You had mentioned in the book that one of the important traits of being a great leader is being a lifelong learner. Tell the group a little bit why you think that is. And if you have a couple of examples of leaders that really did a great job in that regard, that'd be great.
When we have a commencement at a college or law school or whatever, the word commencement means what? End? No, it means beginning. And so I like to remind people, when you go to a commencement, you're beginning your life, and you're beginning your life as an educated person. You're not ending it. I am amazed when I read statistics that show that 30% of people that graduate from college never read another book in their life. They think they don't need to read books. They might read the internet tweets or something, but not a book. So lifelong learning is important because the world's always changing. And if you basically don't learn how to adapt to what's happening, you'll basically be left behind. So in my own case, I try to read as much as I possibly can. And I think reading books is more important than reading tweets because it focuses your brain a lot more. And I do think that great leaders are people that are always learning and are reading and are people that are trying to gain more information all the time. So Jeff Bezos, he started Amazon. He was going to sell books over the internet. But he realized by studying things and looking at all the data that his company was getting and all the surveys they were doing that there was interest in other things being sold over the internet. And so he built this global colossus that isn't really selling that much books over more compared to everything else. He's selling everything else. Books are a tiny part now of what he sells. And he built an incredible company now also with cloud computing, which is really the most profitable part of the business. So he's really learned a lot. He watched what his customers were doing, and he built a really incredible business. But he also, like other people I know, read a lot of books. Bill Gates reads a lot of books, always reading books. He has his own book club, as I understand it. Oprah Winfrey had her own book club. She's a lifelong learner as well. And people might be surprised, but I interviewed George W. Bush. And while people don't consider him a great intellect, I suppose, he is an incredible reader of books. He loves to read books. And I think he grew in the job as a result of reading a lot.
Do you think, David, that a related, and you didn't call this out specifically in your book, but the concept of being a good listener is also important to leadership? I mean, I would consider being a good listener to be sort of akin to a lifelong learner. What are your thoughts on that?
When I interviewed Oprah Winfrey, who made her career in Chicago as a interviewer, I said, well, what made you such a great interviewer? And she said, I'm not that great an interviewer, but I'm a great listener. And she said, that's really the essence of interviewing, is listening to what the person says and then reacting to that. So yes, I think you have to be a listener, because if you ignore your followers, if you basically say, this is what we're going to do, and you don't take any feedback from anybody, you're not willing to listen, I think you've got problems. A perfect example is what's going on now in Russia and Ukraine. Not many, but some people apparently advised Putin that this was not a great idea, that invading Ukraine wasn't so wonderful. There wasn't a lot of support, honestly, in his military for it. He didn't listen. He figured he knew it all. And the result is the debacle we now have. So I don't think leaders have to just do surveys of what people think and go down with 51% support for whatever 51% want. That's what they do. But I do think they should listen to people and get feedback and then take that into account before they take an action.
Good. You mentioned George W. Bush, and I went through, I'll tell you my favorite interview, because I guess I won't offend anyone in the book. My favorite interview was where you jointly interviewed Clinton and George W. Bush. Can you spend a few minutes comparing and contrasting their leadership styles?
It's an interesting phenomenon. Bill Clinton is a cerebral person, very intensely intellectual, loves to read everything, loves data, and can always put the points together. And he's always thinking of all kinds of different angles in terms of policy. George W. Bush, while he does like to read books, was not a policy maven. Bill Clinton, if you sat down with him for an hour or two, he'd love to talk about public policy. George W. Bush didn't like to do it and still doesn't like to talk about public policy that much. He tries to avoid it. They bonded over the years because George Herbert Walker Bush had run against Bill Clinton. They were theoretically not friends, but then they kind of bonded when George W. Bush asked George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton to work on a humanitarian matter together. And they kind of bonded. And then ultimately, as George Herbert Walker Bush kind of aged and wasn't as active, W became much more connected to Bill Clinton. And they were doing an event together that I've been a sponsor of, which is the Presidential Scholarship Program. I did that interview at a program where you have Bill Clinton and George Bush and some other presidential libraries that have come together to kind of support what they call presidential scholars. These are mid-career people that are kind of taking some time to get more leadership skills. And they really have bonded because they both have a pretty good sense of humor. Both of them want to be relevant to the world going forward. And I do think that when you're former president of the United States, there aren't that many people you can talk to have had similar experiences. So when you former presidents, how many people can they really talk to? And so there are a limited number of them. And so I think they bonded because of that experience as well.
In a quick follow-up, do you think that most of the leaders you talk to actively think about leadership as an intellectual pursuit, or is it all a seat of the pants sort of thing?
I don't think it's either. I don't think they spend a lot of time thinking about leadership. I think that's a more academic thing. They take steps that make them leaders, in my view. I wouldn't say it's seat of the pants, because that would imply that they're just kind of, just acting without any forethought, or they're not really thinking deeply about what the implications are, what they want to do. But I don't think they're academically interested in leadership, and I doubt if they're reading a lot of leadership books. except for mine, of course. But I just suspect that they basically have experiences that have propelled them forward, and their experiences have made them leaders, and they rely on their experiences. But I wouldn't say it's seat of the pants, because that would imply too much that they're not really giving thought to what they're doing. I just think they're giving it thought in the academic sense.
So if I can ask, I mean, I know for a fact that you probably didn't have a lot of leadership courses at University of Chicago's law school, because I didn't see any when I was there. What brought you into this study in terms of leadership? I mean, you have an academic interest in it. What triggered it?
Well, many things in life happen by serendipity. I didn't expect to be in the private equity world. I didn't expect to be in the interview world. They just kind of evolved a bit. And so, it just kind of happened this way. When I went to law school, I expected to be a lawyer, and then other things evolved. Today, when I do interviewing, I'm doing it because intellectually I'm interested in learning. I think to be a good interviewer, you have to have intellectual curiosity. You have to let the interviewee be the star of the program, not the interviewer. You have to really be well prepared, so you actually know what you're talking about, in my view. And you ultimately, I think, have to do the best you can to make the interviewee look reasonably good, and make sure that his or her message comes through. And I try to do that in my interviews, and I guess you do as well.
So we have a lot of students on the call today, and many of them are participating in our leadership project. Can you give some advice to the students that are about to start their careers? I mean, in terms of developing leadership skills, what are a couple of things that you would suggest that they think about in developing their leadership skills over time that maybe we haven't talked about yet?
Well, first, you should say, why do you want to be a leader? What's the benefit of being a leader? Why not be a follower? So make sure you know why you want to be a leader. Because if you're a leader, you're going to put up with some sacrifices. You won't have as much time to yourself. You're going to have people criticizing you. You're going to take risks. You're going to fail. You have all the challenges of being a leader. But if you say, no, I want to do something useful with my life, and I can probably be more useful as a leader than a follower, then I think you should do the couple of things that I would recommend, which is continuously read, network as much as possible, learn as much as possible, try to get mentors that can help you as you rise up. Find an area and make it your own. Focus on something. Don't try to be a leader in 50 different things. Try to find one thing and make that your own. Also, try to figure out ways you can have partners who you can share the credit with and can learn from as well, not just mentors. I would also say that try to think of what it is you're most interested in accomplishing with your life, and is there something that you can do that will really lead you towards making progress in that area, and then ultimately, giving back to society, and not trying to become a leader because it's going to make you rich or famous, but because you think it's going to contribute to society, and then figuring out a way to give back to society whatever skills or resources you might come into because of your leadership skills.
Excellent advice for the students. Thanks. I'm going to take some questions now for David. And Vic Dinamar, I know you've got a couple questions. Why don't we start out with you?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of that, David. I had three things I wanted to mention or raise with you. So let me start with the first. Your invocation of Coach K meant a lot to me, because I have tracked his career at Duke since I was in high school, and I agree with you that he's reached the pinnacle of his profession. One of his mentors is a guy I had a lot less respect for, of course, and that's Bob Knight at Indiana, who he worked for. And one of the reasons I never thought Knight was as great a leader, even though he was a good basketball coach or a good basketball mind for sure, is that he was so ill-tempered. Tom Izzo just tied him. I don't know if you saw that when Michigan State beat Purdue on Saturday for the number of wins for a Big Ten coach. But I guess my question goes to temperament. Can you be a good leader if you're mercurial, or does good leadership require kind of a more even-tempered approach to dealing with people?
Well, it depends on the nature of the kind of enterprise. If you're a military person and you have the chain of command in a military, I suspect that you can have this kind of difficult personality where you might be mercurial, but because you are the leader, people will follow you. if you are in a situation where it's not a command and control situation like the military, having a kind of mercurial temperament will ultimately have people drift away from you and not want to work with you. I don't know Bob Knight. I obviously read the same things that you've read about him, and obviously his relationship with Coach K is not what it once was. I would say that I do think it's important to control one's temper. As you get older in life, you realize that probably there are more important things in life than winning a basketball game or something like that. But I do think that Coach K, for example, he gets upset, but he generally is controls his temper. He's made some mistakes in recent years where he apologized for it because he thought he made a mistake. I don't know whether Bob Knight apologized for some of the things that he did that were intemperate, but I do think a good leader is somebody that can control his or her temper. The greatest leader our country's ever had, I think, was Abraham Lincoln. And I don't know any reports that anybody has ever written about that said he yelled at people. He screamed at people. He was mercurial. He obviously had generals that were weak. He obviously had lots of other problems in his administration, but he tended to deal with them in a kind of way that wouldn't make you think he was mercurial and not somebody that you really would respect.
Great. When you see Coach K, you can tell him we all here hope that Duke meets the Illini late in the tournament. That would be a nice thing for all of us.
Okay, well, I will tell him that. Maybe it'll be in the Final Four. You never know.
There you go. Second question I had actually relates to two of the things you've already talked about and a little bit of a tension that I sometimes think might exist between them. That is humility and persistence. Persistence, you're so right that getting anything done requires that you stick to a plan and you work through challenges and you refine, you overcome your obstacles. But I sometimes wonder if people stick too much to what they're doing because they don't have the humility to understand that maybe they got it wrong in the first place. So how do you kind of balance those things? Because part of humility, I think, means changing and adjusting and revising what it is you think you want to do or what you think you can do. For every Phil Knight who had that vision or Jeff Bezos, there are a lot of people equally smart who had a decent idea. But as you pointed out earlier, a lot of life is serendipity and it just didn't work out for them. And if they stuck with that notion too long, we never know about them because they didn't rise to the top. But what would you say about how to trade those things off?
Well, of course, 99.9% of all the companies ever started fail. So we all know about the successful ones. Most companies somebody had an idea and it didn't work out. I think there is a fine line between persistence and being arrogant and tone deaf. Some people I meet in life, they have ideas and they're just tone deaf when I tell them, look, that just is not going to work. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It has no chance. And they don't want to listen. Now, of course, I didn't think Mark Zuckerberg's company was going to get anywhere. I turned that down as an investment when he was at Harvard. So you don't know which things are going to make it and not for sure. But I do think that if you're beating your head against the wall repeatedly and you're getting nowhere, it's probably a pretty good sign that it's not a good thing. Now, you need to have friends around you that can level with you and tell you, look, let me be very honest with you. This is not going to be the next Facebook or SpaceX or something like that. But it's a fine line. Take as example Elon Musk. Elon Musk is not famously humble. Elon Musk is not famously listening to a lot of colleagues. He's done things that are different than the way that I would have done it, but look what he's done. And so, sometimes you get people that defy the odds and they build a company that nobody thought could be built with a personality that nobody really likes. That's just life. But generally, for those of you who are listening or watching, you should pursue the law of averages. The law of averages is that you're more likely to be successful if you listen to people, persist in a polite way, highly ethical, not arrogant. But there always will be exceptions. If any of you listening is a genius and it hasn't been recognized yet, but you're a genius and you think you're the next Elon Musk or Bill Gates, who am I to say no? But I think in the end, you should recognize that if by the time you're 30, 40 years old and you haven't been that successful in your entrepreneurial efforts or your career ambitions, probably you should figure out whether you're doing something wrong and maybe make some changes.
Very helpful. Thank you. My last question asks you to draw on, your professional experience, but also just your wisdom over the years. I worry about whether society and our politics and our culture have changed today to the point where it's less likely that we're going to be tapping people who are good leaders in important positions. So I worry that people like Jimmy Carter or H.W. Bush or Barack Obama, to say nothing of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, I'm not sure they would rise to the top of our political system today. You mentioned already that the influence of money in politics has a very powerful and distorting effect. There's, of course, the social media and the social dilemma. You probably saw that documentary and kind of the way that we're kind of nudged into silos and we don't talking to each other. And then, of course, we have this intense tribalism where people are just, committed to one side or the other. And so are you optimistic about the ability of America to identify good leaders going forward and solve some of these intractable problems that we're confronting?
At the time of the American Revolution, we had 3 million people living in this country. Of those 3 million people, 500,000 were slaves, and 1.25 million were white women. So you had 1.25 million white men who were Christian men, very few Jews then. And of the 1.25 white Christian men, property owners were probably about 10% of them. And so the people who were eligible to be at the Continental Congress or in the Constitutional Convention were probably about 125,000 to 150,000 people were probably qualified, maybe. So out of 150,000 people, we got George Washington, James Madison, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, among others. Today, we have 330 million people in this country. And where are the John Jays, the Alexander Hamiltons, the George Washingtons? If we were going to have a constitutional convention today, where would those people be? Well, of course, all those people are now in private equity, and that's the problem. All the really talented people have gone into private equity. But to be very serious, I think what's happened is the most talented people in the country, in the beginning of the country, felt an obligation to help the country, and the penalty for being in politics wasn't so great. And the sacrifice of one's career wasn't so great. Today, because we specialize in things, people don't want to ruin their careers. There's penalties for trying to put your head up and get involved in politics or government. The best people don't often want to go into government. Now, there are obviously some exceptions, but when you look at members of political bodies, sometimes you kind of say, where are the superstars? Many of them are teaching at law schools. Many of them are college deans. Many of them are university presidents, foundation presidents. The best people don't often serve in public policy positions as much as they used to. And it's a sad situation. I'll give with a final example. I'm the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a kind of a think tank club relating to foreign policy. And talking to somebody there recently, I was saying that where are the great foreign policy professionals, the next generation? Where are the people that are going to be the Dean Achesons of the world and the people that really help make foreign policy an important part of our country's history and profession? And he said, because of hedge funds and startups and private equity, people don't want to go into foreign policy kind of decisions or diplomacy anymore because the pay is so low, the aggravation factor is so high, and the compensation is so much greater elsewhere. It's a big change from where it was even 50 years ago. So a lot of really talented people do not want to go into public policy anymore, and it's a sad situation.
You're exactly right. I think we see it in a big way, even in the narrow legal confines. Used to be so many great lawyers who went in and out of public service, the Lloyd Cutlers, the Ted Olsons. They would be at firms, they would be in government, they would do some stuff with academic institutions. You're right that the private sector and the wealth generation in the private sector in the last 30 years has siphoned a lot of talent away from the public sector. But I guess my question is, how do we turn that around? How do we deal with that?
Well,
because I think you're describing the same reality that I see, but I just don't have any. I don't know what to do about it.
Well, if I had the answer, I would have been in Iowa and New Hampshire a year or so ago. I don't have an easy answer for it. I would say that the law profession when I went to law school, I did consider it to be a profession. And when I started practicing law, I realized it was a business. And one of the reasons I got out of the practicing law, I said, is if I'm going to be in business and basically make money, I might as well be in a business that is more profitable than practicing law. Now, everybody doesn't look at it that way. And some people love practicing law. I didn't really love it that much. I wasn't that good at it. But some people are persisting and want to be members of the legal profession. A good example is our judges. I've dedicated my most recent book effectively to the judges in our federal judiciary and to other public servants, because they're paid so little, but they do such a wonderful job. And think about the compensation. The salary of federal judges hasn't really gone up effectively for 20 years or so. And let me tell you one anecdote about a federal judge that all of you know. His name is John Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States. And I interviewed him for a program I have where I interview people in front of members of Congress. I have a program to interview great leaders and great historians in front of members of Congress to educate them about our country's history and government. And if anybody needs that, it's our members of Congress. So one time I was interviewing John Roberts and I said, well, when you were growing up, Mr. Chief Justice, did you want to be Chief Justice of the United States ever? And he said, no, I had no interest in that. I said, did you want to be a judge? He said, no, I had no interest in that either. I said, well, did you want to be a lawyer? He said, no, I wasn't interested in that either. Well, what were you interested in? I was only interested in American history. I wanted to be a historian and a history professor. My father said, John, there's no money in that. You'll starve to death. Lawyers make respectable incomes. Go to law school. And John said to his father, no, I don't care about money. I'm just going to be a historian. So John's father said, okay, but someday you may change your mind when you don't have any money. So John went off to Harvard, and after his sophomore year, he came back to Boston Airport, Logan Airport from Indiana, where he was living. And he got off the plane, gets in a cab and says, can you please take me to Cambridge? And the cab driver said, well, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history, John said to the cab driver. And the cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. And so John Roberts said that maybe his father was right. He got out of history and became a lawyer, but it wasn't because that was his first love.
Okay, good. That's a great final anecdote. I will say Adrian has a question that he put in the chat. Can you please recommend one or two books that we should consider reading? And David, I'll do that for you. The number one book I recommend is How to Lead. It's a tremendous read, very easy. There's some great stories in there. And David has two other books on the New York Times bestseller list that I would also recommend. Other than your books, David, anything you would recommend to this group in terms of learning more about leadership?
Yes, there's a book that Peter Baker wrote with his wife, Susan Glasser, on Jim Baker, who was, it's got the man who runs Washington. And for a 12-year period of time, Jim Baker was, one of the most powerful people in Washington. I highly recommend that book. It's quite a good book about leadership and how, people can really be a leader. And then I will recommend, I would say Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, because it shows how Abraham Lincoln was able to be president, even though he had the Civil War he had to deal with, and he had in his cabinet all the people that wanted his job because they thought they were better than him. And it shows incredible leadership skills. So those are two books I would recommend.
And I'll just make this announcement to the students now. That'll be one of the books that we'll read, the Goodwin book for our leadership project in the next academic year. So, David, I know that you've got to go to another interview. I know that you're going to be talking with, I believe, Ron Klain, right? You're going to be chatting with him a little bit after you're done with us. So we'll give you a little bit of time to get ready for Ron. We really appreciate your willingness to spend some time with us. I want to thank everybody, all of our students, alumni, and friends around the world for being part of our Leadership Project event, and for Dean Amar for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again someday soon. Okay? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, David.
Bye.